Before we get to the rest of the webinar, I would like to give a land acknowledgement for the area where I am located, which is now known as Kingston, Ontario. And I encourage everyone while I do that to take a moment to think about the land and the peoples in the area that you are located. So I would like to recognize the long history of Indigenous peoples in the area now called Kingston, which is the place where the Great Lakes meet the St. Lawrence River. It was home to the late woodland people from at least 1200 to 1450. It was variously occupied and disputed by the Iroquois, Algonquin, and Huron peoples in the 15th to 18th centuries. When Europeans arrived in the 17th century, they found both the Huron-Wendat and the St. Lawrence Iroquois. Various iterations of trade, conflict, and alliances with first the French and later the British in the 17th and 18th centuries caused further disputes and changing occupation and control over the region by Iroquois and Algonquin people. The word Cataraqui, which names things here from a river, our conservation authority, and a mall, is a French translation of the Algonquin term Cataraqui, which means meeting place. By 1701, the area was mainly occupied by the Mississaugas, which are a different Anishinaabe group from the Algonquins. The chief of the local Mississaugas ceded the land to the British Crown in the 1783 Crawford Purchase, which was negotiated to allow loyalist settlement after the American Revolution. This brought both British loyalists and the Haudenosaunee or Mohawk who fought for the British to this area. The Crawford Purchase involved the land roughly from modern-day Brockville to Trenton, based on rivers as landmarks, and as far north from the lake as a man could walk in a day. Big area. In exchange, the Mississaugas were promised that families belonging to them shall be clothed, and those that do not have muskets shall receive new ones, and some powder and ball for their hunting, some red cloth to make a dozen coats, and some laced hats. In my mind, this is hardly a fair trade. It is worth noting that no formal treaty was ever signed. Additionally, some of the land in the north of the purchase was actually the territory of the Algonquin, and the chief of the Mississaugas did not have the jurisdiction to sell it. The Algonquins have, so far, over 240 years later, been unsuccessful at having this land returned to them. I use this acknowledgement to highlight the rich history of Indigenous people and the complex relationship with settlers in this area and in Canada generally. I thank the many peoples who have been here for the care that they have given this land, where I am grateful to live, work, and play. Thank you. So moving on to our webinar, we will have 3 panelists this evening in this order. We will have Chief Abram Benedict, who is the Ontario Regional Chief, Tony Morris from Ontario Nature, who is our Conservation Policy and Campaigns Director, and Carolynne Crawley, who is co-founder of Turtles Protectors and founder of Msit. And with that, I turn it over to Tony to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Lizzie. I'm pleased to welcome Regional Chief Benedict. Chief Benedict was elected to a 3-year term in June 2024 and advocates, supports, and lobbies for all 133 First Nations in Ontario. Regional Chief Benedict is the first Haudenosaunee person to hold the position of Ontario Regional Chief. Abrams has spent the last 19 years in community leadership, first elected a district chief for the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne in 2006, and later elected the Grand Chief in 2015. Over to you, Chief Benedict.
Thank you, Tony, so much for that introduction, and good evening to all of you. It's a great pleasure to join in this evening with Ontario Nature, to have the invite to speak with you about the work that we're doing at the Chiefs of Ontario and some of the advocacy that we're doing to support the 133 First Nations across Ontario and where we're at now and where we'll be heading. And so, as mentioned, the Ontario Regional Chief is elected position that supports the 133 First Nations in Ontario, a very diverse region that we have, and the current state of affairs that we're in has gotten us to where we're at with respect to Ontario's Bill 5. And so, as we know, we've seen two major elections, one in the federal government and one at the provincial government, and has brought forward two governments that we had previously worked with, and that's the Ford government in Ontario and the Liberal government at the federal government level, led by Prime Minister Carney. And so during both of those campaigns, the provincial election and the federal election, the Chiefs of Ontario, at the direction of our chiefs and assembly, has been very clear that our message has been prior to these bills coming in effect that First Nations needed to be involved at the table when talking about development. And so we have seen the political climate change, the geopolitical situation that exists, and the threat now from the United States upon what the political leaders classified as the threat upon the economy. And so we have, during that time, the campaign periods have been very adamant that, the both governments, federal and provincial, have talked about the resources that are rich in Canada, and then more so in Ontario, rich in the north, and the resources that exist in the Ontario government after being reelected. Brought forward legislation, that they classify as unleashing the resources. And so very disappointing and concerning to us, frankly, one in the process that was been used to bring forward this legislation, very undermining of the jurisdiction of First Nation people that exists. The government of Ontario and the federal government have an honor, what they would call the honor of the crown, to First Nation leaders, First Nation communities. And that is something that as agents of the crown must live up to those obligations. And so we've been very clear to the province of Ontario and to the federal government that the honor of the crown is not optional. And so the process in which they have used is not been one that is anything conducive to reconciliation. As well, I would classify the process that Ontario has used, and as well as the federal government, as being it should be concerning to people who are concerned about the democratic systems that exist in this country in which we live in. And that is a process that has checks and balances, a process that has the ability for persons, people of interest, groups of interest around. In this case, we're talking about natural resources, environmental protections. Folks should have an opportunity to speak to the government about their views, whether it be supportive, concerned, or in opposition. And I do want to acknowledge Tony and the team at Tony and his team for the presentation that they made to Ontario in the position of in relation to Bill 5. And so then we've also seen that the government of Ontario has not consulted with First Nations before bringing forward Bill 5, and so we have been heavy on our position that the government ought to be consulting with First Nations prior to legislation coming in effect. We do know that currently the way the laws have been designed in case law, that the governments don't have to, by law, consult before bringing forward legislation, which is unfortunate, but it definitely doesn't stop them from doing the right thing and morally being obligated to speak with, in this case, the rights holders or persons that are communities that are impacted. And we haven't seen that at all. And so what we have seen since the passing of Bill 5 is the government, reiterate that they'll now begin consultation after this legislation was put through in about, 55 days, now saying we're going to consult, which frankly is insulting to our communities. The other aspect of our messaging and our position has been that it is an undermining of First Nation jurisdiction. And we know that the Ontario government wants to extract resources in various areas, build projects that will support the economy of Ontario or Canada as a whole, and that what they have done is that they have set up this legislation to allow them to do that, and there's no consideration for the jurisdiction that exists of the First Nations. And so my messaging as the Ontario Regional Chief, who I've been elected by the 133 First Nations, is that the federal government, the provincial government need to speak with the rights holders, and the rights holders are the community, the 133 communities in Ontario, and they are the ones that hold the jurisdiction and sovereignty and the ability to determine what the affairs in their community, which is part of the Constitution, as well as reinforced by a number of conventions in Canada, whether it be the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the government's commitment to reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations themselves speak about collaboration with First Nations, as well as the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. And so there's a number of conventions that the government has undertaken that, regardless of it being the province of Ontario or the federal government, they are still the government and an agent of the Crown, should be embracing. And so this, the approach on Bill 5 is very contrary to that. And so understanding that Bill 5 has changed a number of legislation that protects the well-being of the environment, our people have a sacred connection from a connection to the lands, the water, the resources, to everything that's living, as part of our responsibility to the Creator, and that our First Nation communities take very seriously across this region. And so having laws that then give the government, the settler government, the ability to veto protections, to only list certain changes on registries that First Nations may or may not look at, that changes legislation that gives the government the ability to develop projects, to create the special economic zones, is very concerning to our folks. And I know that tonight we're joined by a number of people that are equally concerned of the well-being of our environment, whether albeit here in Ontario or across Turtle Island. And I can tell you that at times it really does feel that the folks that are really care about the environment is numbered. And sadly, at the case of the case of where we are now, it's now the economy is the priority, and what becomes at the sacrifice of our waters and of our lands, and of our natural resources, which in many cases we have seen become decimated and are not cared for in a way that's going to our 7 generations. And so we know that the changes to these legislation and lining up with Bill 5 in Ontario and C5 is going to make it a very difficult time for a number of our folks who are concerned, including the rights holders in Ontario. This current time, we are with organizations like Ontario Nature to bring about awareness, but also to share what we are doing. And we continue to lobby and advocate. We know that now the government of Ontario will start developing regulation. We definitely will be involved in that and making sure that our messages are heard and that we're shaping those regulations to be at least disruptive. In a very sad time it is, because while we don't agree with the approach that was taken on Bill 5, we don't agree that there should not that they haven't done any. We agree that, and we think that we know that they should have, that under my jurisdiction. We're still going to continue to advocate and lobby for the regulations to be conducive to all living and creatures and the waters and the lands that we're fighting to protect. As well, we are working with the Assembly of First Nations to bring about awareness as well on Bill 5 in Ontario. We know that other regions or other provinces have introduced legislation similar, and now we have seen C5 at the federal level that really does, for a short period of time, we felt that Bill 5 alters and changes many protection laws in Ontario. We thought, well, at least we'll have the federal government, we'll have the federal legislation to back us up in areas. And then lo and behold comes about C5 and creates a way for the federal government to do very similar actions that Ontario to do. And so we have Ontario also convening what we consider to be a legal think tank to bring about a number of our lawyers, scholars, folks that work around the Constitution and First Nations jurisdiction to look at what some of those legal options will be. We do know that there are some First Nations already looking at launching individual challenges on Bill 5, including C5. So we're closely working, aligning with them. The other thing is that what we do know is that once Bill 5 in Ontario becomes operationalized, and the government starts granting the economic zones, what we will be requiring is folks to provide, or well, our First Nations will be looking at, and we're asking, the public as a whole to provide additional evidence of where there have been failures. We had a meeting with the Auditor General of Ontario as well, and one of the areas that they will be looking at is whether or not the consultation with Ontarians as a whole was properly done. If folks believe that it was not, they're going to be asking for that additional information. The Chiefs of Ontario will be feeding them information as well on that. And so sadly, it's going to become a state of where we need to document, the failures, but also as the economic zones become a reality, essentially, we will then start looking at the mitigating those measures directly as we sadly have to work through the implications of Bill 5. And so I encourage all of the folks online to follow the Chiefs of Ontario social media. Our website as well has our up-to-date information about the current happenings. We've had a number of communities already take to the streets to share the information in a form of a rally information sessions around the province. We will see more of them. And so we're going to continue to make sure we're communicating that to the general public so that folks who want to participate and show support and bring about the wrongdoings that the government of Ontario has done around the process, consultation, undermining First Nation jurisdiction, and severely making changes to laws that are supposed to protect the environment. We want folks to help support that. And so I'll turn it back to our friends at Ontario Nature. I think that's a high synopsis of what we're doing at the Chiefs Ontario around Bill 5 and a bit on C5. So yeah, we'll go for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Chief Benedict. Very helpful, informative. Next up, we are going to have Tony Morris from Ontario Nature, but maybe actually I'll just do a quick, I've seen a question. Yes, this is going to be recorded and shared later, so you will be able to watch it again. So Tony Morris has joined Ontario Nature in 2024. He holds a master's in environmental studies from York University, where he focused on biodiversity policy in Ontario, and a BA from Trent University with a joint major in environmental studies and political studies. Tony has over 10 years of professional experience with various government departments and agencies in both Ontario and the Northwest Territories. He has a strong background in environmental policy, strategic planning, and land use and watershed planning at the provincial and the municipal level. Over to you, Tony.
Thanks, Leslie. Oops, sorry. Just give me a second. Okay. So I'll provide an overview of what's in Bill 5 and the similar federal Bill C5 that Chief Benedict spoke to, for those not familiar necessarily with all the details in both of those pieces of legislation, and really what Ontario Nature has done to date and where collectively we can go next. So on June 4th, the Government of Ontario passed Bill 5, which is called the Protect Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy Act, despite widespread opposition from Indigenous peoples, environmental groups, farmers, labor organizations, and people across the province. Essentially, Bill 5 eliminates the Endangered Species Act, which was once considered the gold standard of species at risk legislation in Canada. Most significantly, it redefines habitat to just immediate dwellings rather than areas species need to survive, which fundamentally goes against science. It also gives up on species recovery as a core principle of the legislation. It politicizes what was once an independent science-based listing of species, giving that power instead to the government. Another significant change with the new Species Conservation Act is developers or industry simply have to register an activity that harms species with no clear conditions or binding requirements, removing the oversight to ensure adverse impacts are avoided. The new Species Conservation Act is purely performative and will ultimately be devastating for Ontario's biodiversity, leading to further declines of our most vulnerable species. The next most egregious part of this bill is the Special Economic Zones Act, which essentially grants power to Cabinet to exempt trusted proponents and designated projects within special economic zones from having to comply with any provincial law, regulation, or municipal bylaw. However, this act does not define how trusted will be assessed. It completely violates Indigenous rights and deprives the public from meaningful engagement. It also violates the rule of law in that it bypasses the legislature completely by putting all the power in the hands of the provincial cabinet. This aspect of the bill is unprecedented in Canada. Another significant part of the bill is exempting two specific projects from the Environmental Assessment Act, a proposed mine in the Ring of Fire and a landfill in Dresden. Without an environmental assessment, it's unclear how these projects will mitigate potential impacts on the environment, public health, and safety, and it also removes the opportunity for input. Most troubling is through reporting by the Trillium, it has come to light that the company that owns the Dresden landfill has donated around $200,000 to the Progressive Conservatives since 2018. Not noted here is the proposed amendments to the Mining Act and Heritage Act that were also part of Bill 5. Ontario Nature did comment on the Mining Act portion, as that amends the purpose of the Act to focus solely on economic factors, removing reference to Indigenous rights and the need to protect public health, safety, and the environment. The Mining Act changes also give broad powers to the Minister for the operation and functioning of the Mining Lands Administration System without any transparency. Ontario Nature did not comment on the Heritage Act amendments, but Indigenous groups and archaeologists were quite concerned with that. As you can see, Bill 5 is devastating for healthy communities, good planning, species at risk, and the rights of Indigenous peoples, with no evidence that it'll speed up anything. It's really a race to the bottom on a false premise that Indigenous consultation and environmental protections are to blame for slow economic development. Next, I'll provide a brief overview of the Bill C5 recently passed by the federal government. Bill C5 was introduced to the Federal House of Commons on June 6th, 2 days after Ontario passed Bill 5. The numbers are merely coincidental. This bill, the Act to Enable the Free Trade and Labour Mobility in Canada Act and the Building Canada Act, was rushed through the federal legislative process, receiving royal assent on June 26th. Part 1, the Free Trade and Labour Mobility Act, removes federal barriers to interprovincial trade and is not really the part of the bill that many groups are concerned about. The second part of the Act, which is the Building Canada Act, has similarities to the provincial Bill 5 that are concerning. The purpose of the Building Canada Act is to enhance Canada's prosperity, national security, economic security, national defense, and national autonomy by ensuring that projects that are in the national interest are advanced through an accelerated process that enhances regulatory certainty, investor confidence, while protecting the environment and respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. This all sounds good, right? But the process and how that is determined is of concern. The Act allows the federal cabinet, on the recommendation of a minister, to designate a project of national interest. There are factors to be considered, which is an improvement over Bill 5, but these are still fairly vague on how these will be evaluated or rated, leading to a lot of subjectivity. There is a conflict of interest provision in the Act, again, an improvement over Bill 5. It also requires consultation with Indigenous peoples adversely affected, but doesn't go as far as free, prior, and informed consent, despite the fact that Canada has ratified the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP. It also requires a detailed description of the project and why it is in the national interest on a public registry that will also include timelines and cost estimates. Interestingly, though, the registry piece only requires the extent to which the project is expected to meet the outcomes of factors A through D listed on the slide here, omitting the factor related to clean growth and climate objectives. Most significantly, this act could allow projects to be exempt from a long list of federal acts and regulations, including the environmental legislation listed here. The similarities between these two bills are quite jarring. Both bills are incredibly problematic and give unchecked powers to a small group of elected officials behind closed doors, while throwing aside environmental protections, particularly for species at risk. The premise for both of these bills is that we need to strengthen our economy in the face of US threats. But both governments seem to be ignoring that they are behaving exactly like the Trump administration. The US government has significantly weakened environmental protections. In fact, the same week Bill 5 was introduced in Ontario was the same week President Trump weakened the US Endangered Species Act. The Trump administration is also using unchecked executive power to push its agenda. Just last week, the Ministers of Environment from Ontario and Alberta wrote to their federal counterpart to urge the federal government to repeal or amend several key regulations and acts, including the Impact Assessment Act, clean electricity regulations, and limit use of the Federal Species at Risk Act. Polling done at the end of June shows that 58% of Ontarians strongly or somewhat oppose Bill 5. Compared to only 22% that strongly or somewhat support, with the other 20% unsure. The same poll has 46% opposition to Bill C5 and only 31% support. The approach with both of these bills is simply regressive and will undermine decades of progress on labor, health and safety, environmental standards, and any progress towards Indigenous reconciliation, with no evidence that is necessary to speed up projects. In fact, the opposite could happen if Indigenous communities do not consent to these projects in their territories and are forced to tie up issues in the courts. It is a race to the bottom that will exacerbate the climate and biodiversity crises and leave Canada less resilient. Collectively, we must remind our governments that our competitive advantage in Canada is our democratic institutions, our check and balances, and our respect for Indigenous rights and strong environmental protections. Nature is fundamental to the Canadian identity and cannot be sacrificed for outdated thinking on economic development. So what have we done and where do we go next? So our focus at Ontario Nature has mainly been on Bill 5 as a provincial organization. We provided detailed submissions on several of the environmental registry postings for schedules in the bill, including a letter signed by over 100 national, provincial, and local organizations opposed to the changes to the Endangered Species Act. We managed to get one of the few available speaking slots at the truncated 2 days of committee hearings, where I was given 7 minutes to explain why Ontario Nature opposed Bill 5. I was then asked questions by the committee members. That testimony is available on our YouTube. Our Youth Council also provided their own submissions to the Premier on Bill 5 broadly and on the changes to the Endangered Species Act. Additionally, we circulated an action alert calling on the Premier to withdraw Bill 5 and strengthen the Endangered Species Act, which was signed by over 20,000 individuals. We now have a repeal Bill 5 action alert available on our website. We did 3 media releases, including one on June 3rd with 7 other diverse organizations that presented to Standing Committee calling for the bill to be withdrawn. Those groups included the Canadian Union of Public Employees, also known as CUPE, Eco-Justice, Friends of Attawapiskat River, Niskanjika First Nation, Ontario Nature, the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, Toronto Zoo, and Wildlands League. This demonstrates broad coalition building and that it is not a small group selection of organizations that are opposed to this bill. We managed to get extensive media coverage in large and local news outlets and spoke at a rally for endangered species held at Queen's Park on May 28th. We've also been very active across our social media to raise awareness of Bill 5 and share resources, with over 600,000 people reached and over 45,000 post interactions. Like I said, we've been in numerous media stories, and this really helps Ontario Nature expand our reach beyond our usual audience and raise the profile of nature conservation issues with the wider public. So what can we do next? Ontario Nature will continue to offer support to any First Nations or Indigenous organizations that are looking for help on potential legal challenges. We'll also be engaging our partners in the environmental sector, labor, agricultural, even industry to identify collective strategies to get this bill overturned and maintain public opposition. We'll continue to develop resources, tools, and ways that members and supporters can help. The federal government has indicated that it is still committed to its biodiversity and nature conservation targets despite Bill C5. We will be working with national partners to advocate that the federal government hold firm on the Species at Risk Act and effectively implement the Canadian Nature Strategy to halt and reverse biodiversity decline. We're also in the early stages of planning a provincial and national lobby day for nature to occur in the fall, where we'll work with partners to meet with as many elected officials as possible on why nature should be a priority. Now, what can you do? First, if you haven't already, sign our Repeal Bill 5 action alert, which Melina will put the link in the chat. Personalize it as much as you want, and the email will be sent to the Premier and your local member of provincial parliament. Then share it with your networks. Let's double that 20,000 we got on the Stop Bill 5 one. Continue to call or email your MPP or the Premier and let them know you do not accept this vision for Ontario. Let them know we need economic solutions that operate in harmony with nature, not in conflict. That we need an economic vision for the future that respects democratic processes and Indigenous rights, not a race to the bottom. Tell them their desire to speed things up will actually have the opposite effect when there is no public trust and Indigenous groups are forced to take the government to court again and again. You can also organize and attend rallies. I see there was some in the chat mentioning a rally that was held earlier today in Hamilton. Talk to everyone you know and get them engaged. You can also call or email your federal representative and urge them to hold the line on nature protections and ensure the federal government does not fund any nation-building projects that will harm biodiversity and backtrack us on our climate objectives. Remember, it was people power that got the Greenbelt legislative changes repealed. We can do the same thing again here. Finally, I want to close with some hope. Even though it can seem like we're fighting a losing battle, believe me, I know it's exhausting and overwhelming what's going on in Ontario, nationally, and around the world, particularly the constant onslaught of weakened environmental protections by the provincial government and seeming contradictions by the federal government. But everyone joining us here today cares deeply about nature and Mother Earth. We recognize our survival and our well-being is dependent on the natural world. We have millennia of Indigenous wisdom and conservation science on our side. We know Ontarians care about nature. We know nature is a foundation of the Canadian identity. We just happen to be in a moment of time when we have to stay vigilant and committed that we have to fight for what is right. Nature is worth protecting, and I hope you will join Ontario Nature to safeguard our natural legacy each and every day. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Tony. Lots of good information in there. And I think you're going to introduce Carolynne next, please.
Myself. There we go. So Carolynne is the co-founder of Turtle Protectors and founder of Msit, which means all my relations in Mi'kmaq. Carolynne has Mi'kmaq, Black, and Irish ancestry. She is Turtle Clan from Mi'kmaqi territory who has lived in Takaranto, also known as Toronto, for 50 years. She is a holistic nutritionist, storyteller, and a member of the Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle based in High Park. Over to you, Carolynne.
Thanks, Tony, and miigwech and Nyawen, Chief Benedict. I'm just going to share my screen. So for those of you who aren't familiar of turtle protectors, we operate here in the city of Toronto, or Takaranto. Our Anishinaabe name is Michigan Gajajuan. Michigan is referencing turtle, specifically snapping turtle, and Gajajuan is referencing that fierce protectiveness that mama bear has when she's defending her cubs. So we are a grassroots collective. We're Indigenous and volunteered led. That's myself and Jenny, who's the other co-founder, who identifies as a settler, and grandmother Vivian Reckle, who's Anishinaabe. And we launched in the spring of 2022. And what we're doing is trying to reconcile the human impacts upon turtle relatives. So we advocate, support, and protect turtles in some parks across the city. We first started in High Park, and then each year we've expanded, and this is our 4th year. And we have about 200 volunteers that support this work. We bring in this concept of two-eyed seeing. So what that means is that's a concept that Mi'kmaq elder oh my goodness, Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall speaks about, and it's about bringing Indigenous ways of knowing as well as Western science and walking that road together in a good way. We are the only Indigenous-led turtle stewardship or protection group in the city. And our work really started in the height of the pandemic, because myself and Jenny spent about 4 hours with the mama snapping turtle in High Park. We weren't really sure what was happening, but we learned while witnessing her. She was returning to her nesting spot on land. We witnessed her dig, lay her eggs, and then we escorted her back to water because there were so many dogs off leash. And through that whole process, we learned that there was no official turtle protection program in the city, even though all 8 species are at risk in the province and then also across from coast to coast. So the work that we do is really around relationship building, and because we're all interconnected. Whatever happens to the land will impact us. Whatever impacts us will impact the land. And even though we're focused on turtle, we know that turtle is part of this web of life. And so we're not just advocating for turtle, we also speak for coyote and other relatives that we see that are in need of medical attention, that our volunteers will assist them to get to a wildlife rehabber. So when we're talking about this work, we speak about the responsibility that we have in relationship with these relatives, because in all creation stories, we know that Mother Earth, that's who I reference, because I grew up with a deep relationship with the land that was fostered through my family. You know, I was taught to treat all the beings and see them as kin and treat them in the same way, with that love, respect, and gratitude. And when we're in this relationship, we have this responsibility, because we know the earth, Mother Earth, she can survive and thrive without any of us. But there's not one human on this planet that can survive without any of these relations. And so we have a responsibility to tend to those relationships in a good way, for those relationships to be reciprocal, because we're really taught through these colonial and capitalist systems to view the land, earth, the waters, the beings as commodities, something to extract from, to profit from, to gain, to control, instead of seeing them as relationships, because we are dependent upon all those relatives. And the animals, they're seen as our older siblings. They have been teaching us since time immemorial all around Mother Earth, all of our ancestors, how to be on this land. And so we have that responsibility to them. This turtles in the city, there's many turtles in the province, 8 different species, but these are the common ones that are here in the city. So you have the Midland painted, who's at the top right corner with those yellow stripes. You have the blandings, who's considered threatened in the province and endangered in the country. And then you have the common snapping turtle, who's the biggest turtle on land. And then also there's northern map turtle as well. So I'll speak a little bit about why these relatives are at risk and what their roles are and what we can do to protect them. So since the arrival of settlers, the lands have changed significantly. We now have species at risk because of colonialism and capitalism. Prior to that, nations of people from coast to coast to coast have been in deep, meaningful relationship and still are with all of the relatives, because in the teachings, we have that responsibility to do so. And it's about always that responsibility to creator, but also that responsibility to all of creation. Some of the threats to turtles, one of them is habitat loss. For those of you who might not recognize the photo there, that's Ontario Place. For those of you who might not know, or you probably heard about Ontario Place in the news with the big spa, but Ontario Place as well as the Humber, both of those lands have been greatly impacted by development, whether it's a spa or whether it's Metrolinx. Thousands of trees were cut down that have impacted so many animal relatives. In fact, it was documented that many animals were leaving Ontario Place. And what happens is when those relatives are leaving an area of destruction, then there's going to be sort of confrontation with humans. And that's what happened with coyote, unfortunately, that you've heard in the news, because of the cause of people's behaviors. The other threat to turtles is road mortality. You can imagine, it was documented in settlers' journals that there were wetlands from horizon to horizon in this province. And the lands have changed significantly because of the construction of roads. And many of those roads go through wetlands. One of the parks that we operate in is Smythe Park in the city. And this road literally splits the wetlands in half. So oftentimes we will see turtles, especially hatchlings, so those little baby ones that are just the size of a loony, are crushed on the road along with other amphibians and snake relatives. Also, the changes of the climate. So when you hear about flooding, not only does that impact us as humans and infrastructure, that impacts all the animal relatives as well. But you don't hear those stories in mainstream media. But it's important for us to be aware that it's just not us, to not have this human-centric perspective of seeing the world. And I know all of you here that are joining this, you all care, and that's why you're here today. And then also the challenging of sustaining their populations as well, because of all of these threats. And there's many more, especially in the city, whether it's dogs off leash or irresponsible fishing. So the waters have changed significantly in regards to habitat loss. I mentioned this country, coast to coast to coast, is home to 1/4 of the wetlands upon Mother Earth. But these waterways have been significantly impacted. So in the city here in Takaranto, 85% of all wetlands have been impacted. They've either been commodified, buried, diverted, controlled, and that has a huge impact. When you think about floods, those wetlands are important to mitigate those floods. Also in the province and in the country, it's 70% of all wetlands that have been destroyed or impacted because of what's happening through these systems. And that's going to definitely increase with Bill 5 and Bill C5. Just to give you an idea, as far as the road mortality, OTCC, which is Ontario Turtle Conservation Centre, which does phenomenal work, Turtle Hospital in Peterborough. In 2024, they admitted 2,300 turtles. The majority of them were due to being injured on the road. Just last week on the holiday, we got a call of 3 Midland painted turtles that were killed on the road next to just one park. Also, it's estimated that about hundreds or even possibly thousands of turtles are killed on the roads provincially every year. And now just imagine how many other animal relatives are killed if this number is so high. And because turtles are a species at risk, it takes them a long time to replace an adult. So a snapping turtle, she can live up to over 100 years if she's fortunate enough. I mean, she's one of the oldest living beings on the planet. And, you know, they're incredible. Turtles don't become sexually mature until their mid to late teens. Mama snapping turtle can lay anywhere from 40 to 60 eggs at each year. And in her lifetime, she can maybe lay up to 1,500 eggs, but only one is going to reach adulthood. So it's approximately about 59 to 60 years of an adult turtle laying eggs to replace one turtle that's been taken through road mortality or habitat loss or other threats. So in the teachings, I go ceremony. I grew up with that importance that all life is sacred, that all life has purpose. And some of the roles that turtle has in this web of life is they help to maintain the populations of other aquatic beings, and they kind of keep them all in check. You know, their Western science will label them as a keystone species. And we could think about, you know, turtles are also prey for other beings. So those hatchlings, they're food for the first 3 years of their life. Turtle eggs are food for so many other beings as well. They help to maintain the water quality. And so what they're doing is they're cleaning the waters. They're consuming all the dead, decomposing animals and plants, which would eventually reduce oxygen levels in those waters. So they're the cleaners of the water, right? Just like there's cleaners on land, there's the cleaners who are of the sky. So you can think about turkey vultures, even seagulls and other relatives. They also help to disperse nutrients in the waterways as well, whether it's through their feces, but also by consuming dead animals. You know, there's nutrients that go out into the water. And then they also support the structure of habitats as well. And by doing so, you'll see a lot of times turtles basking on logs in ponds, and those logs also create habitats for other beings. So the impact of Bill 5 and C5 is huge. It's quite upsetting, and I know a lot of you are upset about this as well. This is not only threatening species at risk and other animal and plant relatives, this is a threat to all of us living here. And especially First Nations people and communities where these developments are going to be happening, because I know I've had the privilege to travel up into Attawapiskat numerous times and, you know, speak with community members about the impacts of De Beers mine, for example, and other mining projects. So there's going to be increase of pollution in the air and the waters and the soil. And as Tony mentioned, it redefines that term habitat as far as protections. And it also, you know, as you know, weakens environmental protections, and that's going to have an impact on parklands, for example. What's going to stop the government to designate a special economic zone in a place that's already a park? You know, so it will also increase the deaths or mortality of animals, impact the turtles' habitat and other animals as well. So turtles, they brumate at the bottom of ponds, which is a form of hibernation over the winter. They nest on land. They will feed in the waters, but some species, for example, blandings, will come onto land to forage. And then also that will affect their reproductive cycles as well in the waters if the waters are impacted and poisoned. And it will also possibly decrease the monitoring of species at risk due to regulation changes and funding. So imagine if the populations of turtles were to disappear or significantly decrease. the waterways would become significantly sicker. Already the waters are sick. So the increase of blue-green algae blooms, which decreases oxygen. So this is happening in one park in the city where there was just a massive fish die-off just days ago. And I know the TRCA and the Ministry of Environment are monitoring and doing water samples. And those blue-green algae blooms, they're caused by pollution. And also the populations of other beings will be impacted. So if there aren't turtles to kind of help keep that population in check, there could be increase of certain insects, and it's going to affect the web of life, but there's also going to be a decrease of animal populations too, because like I said, turtles are also a food source for other beings. So as I mentioned, whether it's their eggs or those hatchlings. Also, the cultural relationship between turtles and Indigenous communities from coast to coast. We have stories in my territory about turtle. You heard Chief Benedict talk about Turtle Island and, about the creation story of some nations where we're residing upon about turtle. Also, the changes in the aquatic plants, decrease in nutrients, and decrease of biodiversity. And also turtle, one of their roles is when they're consuming those dead animals and dead plants, it helps to reduce greenhouse gases. So they are actually what people could consider like climate change fighters in that sense, right? Because they're having that impact. And so those greenhouse gases will increase with the decrease of turtle populations. So this is a quote from Grandmother Vivian. We were interviewed by CBC about the work that we do. So we have a responsibility as Anishinaabe people to take care of those beings because they are the ones that sustained us from the beginning of time. They're the ones that taught us how to survive, how to live. The least we could do is honor them and protect them as well. And then Turtles Kingston says, turtles are a keystone species, meaning that they have a disproportionate impact on the ecosystem compared to their numbers. Turtles help to maintain the structure of aquatic habitats, which is vital for the survival of many other species, such as fish, frogs, and birds. Without turtles, the entire food chain would be disrupted, leading to the collapse of entire ecosystems. And so, as I said, whatever happens to the land and to the waters and the beings impact us and vice versa, for we are all interconnected in this web of life. There is no separation between us and the land. Nature isn't something other than us. We are part of nature. And so what can you do? Believe that we can make a difference. Remember that we're stronger together. It's important for people to build alliances with one another. So all of our voices can be heard, because it's just like with the Greenbelt and the public outcry and the Ford government reversing that. Standing with Indigenous peoples all across from coast to coast to coast against Bill 5 and Bill C5. It's so important. You have a responsibility as treaty people to stand with Indigenous peoples. That's a part of that reconciliation. Also, be vocal, contact in whatever way local MPPs, provincial and federal offices, support groups that are actively on the ground protecting species at risk, sign petitions, engage in meaningful conversations with those that you know in a good way. Because it's like when you're sharing something with somebody and somebody has a difference of opinion, oftentimes people are engaged in an argument and nobody is listening to the other person's perspective. And so it's really important that we take that time to share. And if somebody has a different opinion and they support these bills, inquire why. Ask them questions. Because, a lot of times people are just unaware. There are people that are definitely consumed by the profit and the gain, or people who are fearful of, all that's happening in society today. People are overwhelmed, and it's really important to have those meaningful conversations in a good way. Because when we take that time to share from our hearts and listen from our hearts, then we can move together in that good way. And also the importance of self-care. You know, when we're doing this work, whether whether you're in First Nations, whether you're in an organization, while you're individual community member, and you're trying to do whatever you can to stand up against these things. And there's so much going on around the planet. There's a lot of suffering, but it's really important for us to take care of ourselves in the process, so that we continue to fill up our cup, so we don't burn out, and that we support each other along that way as well. And so I just want to say, Gichimi Gwech, Walalio.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Carolynne. I never get tired of hearing about turtles. Okay, so now we're going to do our Q&A session. So just a reminder, if you have a questions for the panelists, you put it in the Q&A section specifically, not in the chat. Don't raise your hand. We won't be addressing any raised hands. Yeah, so the first thing I just want to address is that there's a few questions about where people can get information and talking points. So I'll maybe partially answer that, but then Tony, maybe, or anybody, if you have more to add about that. If you go to our sign or action alert, even if you don't want to send the form letter, there's a lot of good talking points in there, but why we oppose them. So you're welcome always to use those and rearrange them or whatever, and use them for other purposes. Also, our joint letter that we sent opposing the Changes to Species at Risk Act is also on our website, so a lot of good talking points there. Tony, I don't know if there's anywhere else that you want to.
I've seen the chat too, a lot of people putting the responses they've been getting, particularly from conservative MPPs, and they certainly have a script, and they use the same kind of talking points quite a bit. And I got those questions when I presented to committee. So if you have a chance to view the committee presentation, you can hear some of my responses. I think I will continue to add resources to our Bill 5 campaign website with those sorts of things, those typical kind of responses you're going to get and how you can potentially respond to those. So it's on my to-do list.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Chief Benedict, who is still here, I believe. Chief Benedict, will First Nations continue to work on a repeal of Bill 5 or more on a harm mitigation approach, or both?
Thanks for that question. I appreciate that. So our chiefs in assembly passed a resolution asking for the repeal of Bill 5 that was passed by our chiefs in assembly about 3 weeks ago. Regardless, we'll still continue to advocate for the repeal, but also will feed into the development of the regulations. And so, we want to continue to build the public pressure on the repeal of the legislation. I know that Tony mentioned earlier what we've seen with the Green Belt. It definitely is, the government backs down under pressure. And so we're hoping that we can continue to mount that. So it's a bit of a both. I mean, we want the repealed, but we also can't negate the fact that, going forward, these regulations will greatly impact our territory, the territorial lands and our rights.
Thank you, Chief. Quick question, does anyone know, is there any connection between this legislation and the also pen hunting practice that has been brought in by Premier Ford? I think these are separate things, but if anybody can address that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no direct connection, but there's a bit of a pattern with the current government in terms of backsliding on environmental protections and kind of changing rules for particular interests.
Next is that rumor has it, the government has started blacklisting those who spoke up against Bill 5 at legislature. Can anyone confirm or deny whether that's happening?
Well, there's not really very much funding coming from the province to like environmental organizations anyway, so that really hasn't been affected. There are certain environmental groups that I'm aware of that did not get selected to speak at committee. There were only 2 days of committee hearings. It's a fairly opaque process on how the selections happen. So Ontario Nature was fortunate to get one. Whether that has now put us on the list, I don't know.
Okay, and similar to the question about resources, talking points for the lobby day in nature that planning has started for, will there be some kind of toolkits or something for local organizers?
Yes, that's the intent, to have toolkits and like kind of advocacy training for local groups as well.
Tough question. What should we do if our local MPP refuses to reply or even acknowledge when we attempt to ask them a question?
Be persistent, I guess. Remind them that you're a constituent of theirs, and encourage others to reach out if more and more people in their constituency are asking the same question. Becomes harder for them to ignore.
And just because they don't answer doesn't mean it didn't register necessarily. Okay, a couple questions along this line, but what is the most respectful and effective way for settlers to support and amplify Indigenous voices and leadership in opposing Bill 5?
I can add a bit to that. I mean, I think that a couple of things, just on the questions that were asked earlier, which, sadly, if the member isn't answering, that's one thing. But I think, it really is collaborating with, the local First Nation community that may be there. There really is strength in numbers. I think that if you're showing at the constituent's office or the member's office and they're not replying, if you show up there with 3 other folks type thing, or 3 other people asking the same question, that at some point they have to start acknowledging that. And so, at this point, it really is about sharing the information, creating the public pressure on the government. I mean, it's whether it be through social media, through continuous advocacy, writing members, letting them know that it's not acceptable. That's really is how we're looking to get folks to support that. There will be legal challenges coming. We will definitely be looking for folks to help advocate for that or support that, perhaps financially. I can't, go into a lot of detail on that. The other thing that I talked about as well is the Auditor General for Ontario. It's about the implications of the Bill of Rights, the Environmental Bill of Rights. These sort of things are a bit after the fact, but I think that also mounts the public pressure on the government as well. If the Auditor General is reviewing, whether or not they consulted with Ontarians fully, or that it was posted properly like it should be, or the government, through the Auditor General, one of the things that they look at is whether or not it's adequate posting. So if they're posting very minimally and it's not adequate for Ontarians to understand, these are things that the Auditor General wants to hear about, and so that they can, look at launch either investigations into specific consultation failures, or part of, which we're encouraging to do, is a more wholesome on Bill 5 itself. And so the more that they hear from folks saying, what are you doing? These are other entities that will be pushing on the Ontario government to do something or to react, and that's essentially what we want. So it really is collective advocacy.
Thank you. Question, is Bill 5 unconstitutional?
I'm not a lawyer on that. I mean, our position from our First Nation leadership that it is unconstitutional. The federal government, the provincial governments are the crown, that they have, treaty obligations to First Nation communities, that they need to respect that honor of the crown. And so, we will be seeing constitutional challenges launched against Bill 5 C5 coming up. And I think that folks again need to share that information on the issue of how do we support. We have already seen a number of demonstrations across Ontario. We will see more, and I think that it is important that folks educate other people. This is not, this really one is a First Nations rights a responsible a relationship that First Nations have with the lands and the territories and the resources, but it's also the relationship between the Crown and First Nations that the Crown is failing on. And so, that's the information. It's not about upset First Nations people who are against development. It's about people who are trying to protect the environment, so that the 7 generations have this going forward. And so I think that being part of or sharing that information as we see them across the province is important.
Thank you. So question about economic gains and how all of this is being done in the name of the economy, but as I think most people here will know, are there, is anyone discussing the economic losses from not protecting the environment, such as floods, fires, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly been part of our messaging that the economic value of nature and the ecosystem services it provides. Yeah, I can put in the response to our budget submission that was provided to the province as well. The provincial budget was passed the same, and we encouraged investment in nature, which shows that there's big economic gains in that. And yeah, and some of the messaging too, like in terms of mining, that tends to overestimate the contributions of mining to economic development and jobs. And we have a situation in Ontario where there's hundreds of mines that have never really been cleaned up, and it's taxpayers essentially paying the price for that, and most often Indigenous communities that are paying for it in health and other social costs. So, but Chief or Carolynne?
Part of our communication strategies for Ontario will be as well as assessing those economic impacts to the delays. I mean, I think that's one of the things we've been very clear as well that part of our messaging will be to the investors, because I mean, let's face it, somebody has to pay for mining development, or somebody there are investments. So this is about the economy and the the almighty dollar, and so we want to demonstrate that without First Nations involvement, with approaches like Bill 5, that those investments, albeit the government is saying this will make them more secure, it's going to in fact do the opposite, and that potentially could have detrimental financial impact if there's either not a change in government approach, or at the very minimum First Nations being deeply involved right from the onset of a concept, never mind any project itself.
Thank you. So the next question is about First Nation voices, which have too often been overlooked and whose communications have been unheard and whose rights continue to be disregarded. How can we ensure our voices, and I think they're referring to First Nations voices, carry as powerfully as those of the majority?
Well, I think that, I mean, a number of the things that we have already, expressed of how we can show support or what we can do is part of that. We are, as a political advocacy organization, working with our political territory organizations across the province to ensure that we're supporting the on-the-ground movements, but also working through our, our political channels to the federal government and to the provincial government on either, repealing, or repealing is obviously our first what we want, but also, navigating the current political systems. And so if things don't change, I think that we're going to see much more action on the ground, and I think that this will definitely have more of an impact than any of the letter writing campaigns or the questions to members of parliament. And so it really is a stay tuned sort of moment, and we are supporting those communities who are organizing those such actions.
Thank you. I've got a few questions with a similar slant that I'll try to summarize, but it's about sort of the best tactics and the best methods for engaging the public and our governments. So one question about the tone that we should use, one question about using things like blockades or court challenges. Is there anything sort of key that the panelists think that we should focus on and that individuals and groups can focus on?
From my perspective, I mean, I don't think that there's a singular at this point. I think, again, we have described a number of initiatives that we have ongoing. We are also looking at, what some of the international efforts or avenues may be as well. I mean, it's deeply concerning that we have legislation like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples legislation, and then we see C5 come out that is, quite contrary to what the principles, but as well as what's in law around free, prior, informed consent. I mean, the government has continued to boast that, that every project will have to have, First Nations involvement and will need consultation and what have you. But it is completely contrary. And so we are looking at what some of those internationals could be. But definitely those are all part of the political pressures that we want to mount on Canada and Ontario to reverse the current actions that are being taken.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think, there's no one singular. It's a mix of, using facts, using science. It's a mix of emotion. It's a mix, always try to keep the tone respectful and balanced as well. And to really show that, there's nothing radical about wanting a secure future and wanting to protect the environment. There's nothing out of the ordinary about that. And social media is a powerful tool, but there's lots of different ways you can do it. You can amplify voices of other people that you're seeing that have quite large followings as well, and really just pay attention to what events are going on in your communities and any rallies that are being held. But Carolynne, I guess has your experience on the ground, what's effective?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, all of this can really elicit really strong emotions, like anger. And I think it's really important that we have control of our own anger, because when we lose that control, then things don't get resolved or solved. You can see that when two people are arguing with one another and they're heated in those emotions, it's not until you step away and have control of your emotions. So even when you're at rallies, it's important, right, to be very calm and do what you need to be able to be in control of those emotions, because unfortunately, the state will use those things against people when they start to see people getting angry, and will instigate things to increase that anger in people. And unfortunately, it comes at the cost of people who may be vulnerable. And I think too, like here in the city of Toronto, You know, Idle No More will have rallies for people to attend, so pay attention to what they're doing. You know, getting involved. If you don't have any groups in your area, you can, like, I mean, myself and Jenny, we're just two people that wanted to protect turtles. We had a vision and we decided to do something. And, you know, we're in our 4th year and we're making a difference. And so we have that ability to make a difference, and that importance to believe in that as well. And so you could start something and, you know, build relationships with First Nations communities, and build relationships with Inuit Métis communities across from coast to coast to coast, right? And learn ways to be able to stand with them is really important when they're organizing you know, these rallies or events or whatever it may be. It's important to be there.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a question about taking it to court, and I think Chief Benedict already partially answered that, that certainly First Nations groups will likely be taking some challenges to court. Is there another avenue, like besides the Indigenous consultation and Indigenous rights avenue, or is there any other sort of legal battles that can be fought?
Well, so I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, I do have to sign off. I have to head out. And I thank you for the opportunity, Yamago. I really appreciate it. But as I mentioned earlier, you know, as we see, without the change in the legislation, we're going to see the they'll start operationalizing the legislation itself and start designating zones. And that's really when the rubber will hit the road on challenges, because that is when we will see that consultation requirements will not have been met. That is when we'll see that, you know, either you know, other areas of breach of fiduciary to the federal government, provincial governments will be occurring, and so those will start spurring challenges individually on their own, and we will, you know, definitely be supporting communities as they do that as well. So thank you so much through Ontario Nature, Miigwech. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's great to be on a great panel this evening, sharing some very important information. I know this won't be the end of it, so Yamagoa.
Miigwech, Chief.
Thank you.
The one thing I was just thinking about, like when I was talking about that importance of controlling one's anger, it's also important to know that when we are sitting in those strong emotions, not only is it challenging to resolve conflict, but it also creates physical harm onto our own physical bodies as well. And so that's why it's so important for that self-care. I mean, there's a lot of Western science to show that when you are in strong emotions of anger for a period of 5 minutes, it can actually suppress the immune system for up to 6 hours. So that's pretty significant. So that's why it's so important to take care of ourselves and to really look at history. What are some of the passive ways that movements happened that were very significant in history, and to kind of take that on as well.
Great, thank you. I think we'll just do a couple more questions before we wrap up. We will, like I said, include the recording, and we'll also include some resources like links to the different websites and things like that in the follow-up email. So one more question is, it seems we're only pushing for repeal. What if it doesn't get repealed? And how can we reinforce consultation and environmental protection in other ways within the framework of the new legislation?
It's a very good question. You know, obviously, the government is still going to have to do regulations and designate like special economic zones. So even if they stay the course on these this bill and the pieces of legislation under it, there's still an opportunity that the local pushback of basically not with supporting First Nations communities and really what projects would happen on their territory. There, you know, there are still some safeguards in place. The Special Economic Zones Act in particular, that portion, like it is quite unprecedented in Canada. So I really, either the government removes it voluntarily, or it is likely there will be a constitutional challenge on that. So it's hard to envision that staying in place. The Endangered Species Act one, maybe I'll just speak a bit to that one. That one will be a bit harder, and I think that's the sort of thing where, again, collectively, and Ontario Nature will continue to build broad coalition of the importance of species, and that really species at risk represent kind of the canary in the coal mine, and that governments change. So, continuing to that public awareness and that public education to build the case of why this is important and why these protections were put in place in the first place. And, policies change, legislation evolves. So, stay the course, I guess, is what I'll offer. But Carolynne?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I really fully have an answer, right? Because it's so hard to say what to do. But I think, we all have individual collective responsibilities to this relationship. And, if things don't change, then what can we do to be of support to our relations? And how can we actively be involved in that way? Is something that people will need to think about, because whether it's in your community or elsewhere across the country, what is it that you can do? Because there could be something, right? And I think it's really an opportunity for people to mobilize and start having these conversations of what can they do if things don't change. Maybe you start like a turtle protection program, something like that. Maybe you're out there, connecting with wildlife rehabbers. There's a list of all the wildlife rehabbers in the province. A lot of them financially are struggling. So if you have the finances, maybe you're giving donations to them to support the work that they're going to be doing, because they're going to be doing a lot more work as this moves ahead.
Thank you. That actually wonderfully ties into what I was going to have as the last question, and be a little bit more positive. What sorts of local small scale projects like turtle protectors can we do? And maybe some people can put some ideas in the chat that we can do to minimize the impacts of Bill 5. So yeah, turtle protectors is a great example. There are lots of projects like that going on across the province. If there's not something in your area, maybe you want to start one. Working on a local scale, protecting what's in your area, like Carolynne suggested, I think is a little positive thing that you can do besides all of the contacting your MPP and rallies and all of that. Is there anything else, Tony or Carolynne, that you would like to end off on before we wrap up?
I'll let you go first.
I just want to express my deep gratitude for all my relations, for all of these beings, for all that they offer, for all their sacrifices and their teachings, right, in order to support us in our daily lives. And I want to thank all the people that took their time out here this evening to learn more, or figure out what to do, or just to come in solidarity, to know that you're not alone, that there are others that care as well, because sometimes when you see things on the news, it can be so overwhelming. And it's so important to connect with people that you can get that support from as well. So share your stories, and take care of yourself. That's really important.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. That was well said. I think, yeah, we're stronger together. Keep hope. Nature is a healer. Nature is too important. It is, we all need it to survive. We all derive joy from it. So it's worth protecting, and it's worth, putting in day in and day out to protect. So, but yeah, do take care of yourselves, and together we can have this overturned, just like in the Greenbelt fight. So, never underestimate people power.
And just one thing, if you're interested in supporting turtles across the province, you can go on Ontario Turtle Conservation Center, and they have an interactive map and lists, I think, all the turtle groups across the province. So maybe you can get involved as well to help these relatives, because they are having a hard time. And it's a beautiful gift to spend time with turtles and all the other relatives.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much to Chief Benedict, who had to leave, and to Carolynne and to Tony for speaking to us today, sharing all this information and insights. And thank you to all of you who joined us today, and all of your wonderful contributions through the chat. That's great. If we didn't get to your question, and it's something that you think Tony can answer, then please do send it to me, and I'll compile them, and we'll do our best to answer those after the fact. And like I said, the webinar is recorded. You'll get an email in a couple of days that has the recording and the other resources with it. So thank you very much for coming, and hopefully we'll overturn Bill 5 soon.